forensics in particular, but you need to kind of understand all those aspects. And this just gives you a little high level background. I'm not going to belabor it with it too much. I think the more important thing is that I want to share with you is if you look over to the left side, right? So I've probably built now, this is a little outdated actually. Now when I look at it, I've actually built 10 enterprise risk management frameworks and for over 5 institutions. And I've also worked with the military, governments, and agencies. So I understand some of the dynamics and all the regular muster that is honed in with regards to the stringent requirements in the government space. And in my career stint, I've actually managed over multiple millions of dollars of businesses and functions, ranging from managing technology for a large conglomerate like JP Morgan Chase, where I was responsible for all the technology, including the resources, the vendors, and all that exposure. So, so that just gives you a little bit on a high level. So I want to say one of the most important things with regards to what kind of makes me, I won't say I'm an expert, thanks Grace for that accolade, but I in my career stint have actually reviewed, participated, and actually led over 300 plus audits across the globe. And I've actually established programs and frameworks with regards to client engagement, some of which never existed before. And really understanding, and client engagement would be like a business partner. So you may have a financial backing business partner, or you may have a business partner that does a big component of the work that you do. So that just gives you a little bit chunk of my background. So I enjoy this. This is my sandbox, and I'm very excited to be, helping Temple in this space. And in particular, building the compliance, the audit, and that kind of bringing in that regulatory and legal insight. So let's talk about what really is the problem statement. With over 20 million companies, right, there's only 1% that are probably public, like say, for example, in Latin America, and Brazil, and what have you. But in the United States, a lot of our companies are public, right? And so we have some real big issues. And I want to really hover in on that. The biggest concern with regards to risk management, audit, and compliance is around data and the complexity of it, where it's stored, how it's utilized, where it's how it's being stored at rest in particular, right? And more importantly about that is our personal data. So HIPAA is really, really important. And we could talk about, there's probably over 1,000 frameworks, right, that are out there in this risk space. And we really don't, no one would ever have the time. We would fill up a whole year if we wanted to talk about these frameworks, right? And there's a lot of companies and entities that provide what they call governance and risk and compliance. And but the biggest thing that I have found in my 10 years, that everything is kind of centered around data and the manipulation of that data and how that data is at rest. And so I found a way to kind of combine all the regulatory mandates, requirements, all the things that they say you must have. So that top, say 70, 80% of everything. And then the various different entities and constituents that are involved in performing those evaluations, whether they be internal, external type of regulatory reviews, right? And so we want to make sure that from a data perspective, we're really understanding what's the problem, right? The problem is that your data is everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in your badge card reader that you have. It's in simple things that you do when you're at the grocery store. We all have these great phones now. They're very sophisticated, and maybe we don't really think about how sophisticated they are. So let me give you a tidbit of fact. These phones that have been generated probably in the last 10 years are as robust as a mainframe system. And they're in the palm of our hand. So basically, there's a lot of content that's in those data. And I really don't have to kind of explain that to you guys. I'm sure you guys are well aware that this is a very complex environment. But the real problem is that the financial businesses, and some people think, and some companies think, they don't have a financial business. So when I'm thinking of financial businesses, or when I'm saying that, yes, we're talking about the traditional ones that really quote themselves as financial organizations. But if you think about it, every business has some financial aspect. You have payroll, right? You make payments, or somebody in your business may purchase something if you're in products and services, right? So therefore, you're going to have some exposure to some type of financial aspect. And understanding that and how it's important into your specific business is really, really key. right? So we want to focus on, and this is what I'm going to get into in the course, are what are those regulatory things that are really, really high on the list, and where are they really concentrated, and how does that map into, you know, a financial business, a large business, a small business, and how we can actually comply to some of these things and assist the business entities with those, as opposed to just letting them go in their normal fashion. And when Grace mentioned in this, the IADIA course and the overall curriculum, right? It's really important that businesses and functions and different entities are looking at how do they manage their risk. And let's break that down a little further. We're talking about not just risk here in the US, but also some that could exist if you do business internationally. And now with technology and of course this pandemic, lots of businesses are now actually a little more global than they intended. So I'm not going to bother you, but I had put this together before and I wanted to share, but let's just keep on the focus of what we're talking about, because risk management is a very broad topic, just like many of the things that I had on my list of all the things that I have experience with. That's all great, right? We'll want to focus on specific things that are related to risk and the construct of what the businesses and entities and even financial as well as educational institutions need to kind of adhere to. You have business functions, you have your planning, your initiatives, your goals, whatever your drivers are, right? And then we also have things that run those things, you know, our operating systems, our software, application, our coding, digital technology, financial processes. It's just endless. So in every pivot construct, you could have a potential exposure risk. So let me talk about why this course is important and the framework that we're building, right? So for security and digital forensics, is the high level of this course is really going to hone in on some of the basic the IT security understandings and understanding that importance as it's relative to audit and compliance. And also looking at the terminology and that particular, the governance structure. And our goal, my goal, right, is to kind of have this program established more like a capstone, but don't think of capstone in that traditional sense in the brick and mortar kind of master's programs, right? Think of capstones more encapsulated inside of a particular course, or maybe a set of 1 or 2 courses, whereby you may have some interrelated connection points, right? But yet your overall, the end result is we're going to be performing an audit assessment. Now, this really hasn't been done before. There are a couple of institutions that are thinking about these kind of things to do, but they really haven't kind of married all of the complexity of what really is mandated by the governing agencies, right? And the business functions, and then taking the footprint of those different layers of business functions, right? So leveraging those methodologies are going to be really, really key for any participants that are going to, you know, take this course. And the scope is really going to hone in on a lot of the data privacy laws. Why? Because that is the one single common thread. Your social security number is a common thread. Most companies about 15 years ago were instructed, right? It was a law that they're not supposed to use social security as a key. Right. Well, let me tell you, that's still happening today. So does it mean they're in violation? Does it mean they have a risk? Probably in some regards, but if you're using that as a sole key, yes, that could be a major risk. Even academia places aren't to use your social security. That's why you have a unique ID. So the exposure to understanding that and how it relates to, let's just say, the plethora of rules and regulations, whether it be from HIPAA or PCI. And if you don't know what PCI is, that is for the payment card industry. You have a debit card. You have a virtual type of maybe account, banking account, any of those things, they leverage PCI, which stands for managing the data and the security criteria around how your private information is stored. If you own a home, right, or you're renting, right, your information is stored somewhere, right? And when you filled out that application, most likely you had your social security number on it. And most people realize that information could get moved if the mortgage company is bought out or sold off to another entity, right? But what happens to the data and the content of your information will be mind-boggling and probably will scare you. I'm sure you've heard about the recent incident where there was a judge, and it's unfortunate that, you know, someone compromised her information and came to her home and unfortunately shot, and her son died and her husband was severely ill. That was really heart-wrenching, because from a risk perspective and managing audit and compliance in my career, I find that there are ways that we could prevent that kind of information being disclosed. And that is where I think both the United States and in other countries are still kind of shortfall. So that's why we want to focus on audit and compliance and explaining how that data is most important, breaking it down into the various different components, whether it be customer identifiable information or not, and then tying that to the laws and the regulations and how information must be protected. So the most important about this is that compliance, because the management of how checking the different components and how this information is actually displayed and managed and tracked, and just think about it in transport. You may do Zelle and Zelle your information to another person. What do you use for Zelle? You use their phone number or you use their email address. At least those are the two I know about. There may be another type that I don't know of today. But you use those mechanisms, right? And that also has your personal information, particularly if it's in your phone. So we want to be able to tie some of this really critical life things that happen in the industry and bring that forward, and then get the students to understand that, and then take that as a part of that capstone, as I mentioned, and bringing that into a niche business value. So if they work, then that's great. If they don't, we'll give them a typical company that they would be able to leverage with. And so that's kind of my game plan with this program. And with that, I'd like to see if there's any questions. Kind of went kind of fast, so I figured I'd give us more time in the end. And I'm going to stop sharing.
How do corporations or just businesses in general that are looking to be compliant take into account to bring your own devices?
That's a very good question. Oftentimes, if they're a mid-sized to large company, they usually have a security protocol process in place, which would address that. But most companies do not. And so what they typically have done, and I found this very interesting, is that they either use different software tools that will enable, you can use key fobs and things of that nature, that will allow the person to actually securely VPN into virtual private network into the actual business entity. And most software applications do have that component if they're dealing with any of the privacy stuff, like data and your personal information. Most of them do, not all.
I have a question, hopefully you can answer. So I love your knowledge base, so I'm hoping I can pick your brain a little bit. So, obviously with compliance, when it comes to the cybersecurity industry specifically, it was always focused, historically on more like the enterprise, larger level companies, where now it's everybody. It's the SMB, the small to medium sized businesses, and trying to get them to understand the compliance regulations. Sometimes they just don't think that it adheres to them. What is a way to approach that, not gracefully, but and let them know that, hey, this is going to be universal soon, or it is already, but trying to get them to understand that better has been a struggle for me.
Yes, it is a struggle. I equate that to two times, like in regards to the way people understand information. So the method that I've used in the past is I've actually internalized it to what's most important to them. So let me give you a specific example. I'm going to use audit as an example, and then I'll give you a compliance question. So most people, when they hear the word audit, they run and hide, right?
Sure.
Nobody wants to deal with an auditor, right? They're not your favorite person. You just don't want to deal with them. It's a pain in the you-know-what. So basically, right? When I kind of went into audit, I was actually brought into audit. I never volunteered to be an auditor ever in my life. And actually, to be honest, I actually struggle with it because I'm a very creative individual. So the one thing I encountered was I found that people really didn't understand why people were auditing them. They had no concept. They didn't have a correlation. And so typically when they saw the auditors come, they literally would be like, oh my God, this auditor's coming. I don't know what to do.
Right.
And so I handled it differently. I just sat down and had a frank conversation with them and tried to understand what their business drivers were.
Mhm.
And so I was the auditor rebel, if you will, you know, and I like the fact of being a little bit of a disruptor in that sense, because I think that is how you gain a lot of information when you just speak to people very plain and frank. And so what I did is I just demystified it for them. So
Gotcha.
similarly now with compliance, since I've actually done that as well, with compliance, typically in organizations, if they're mid to large size, the compliance people actually work in the businesses, or they're a smaller group that actually is supported and aligned in that business to some degree. So they may oftentimes have a little bit of knowledge of the functional areas. So where I would really leverage is, get to know that compliance person. And if you are that compliance person, then get to know the business areas that you are going to work with and evaluate. I think there's no independent person that can come outside of an organization and learn or know as much as the persons who are actually doing the work on a day-to-day basis. I just firmly believe that. And so I would say get to know them and get to understand what their drivers are, and then bring your knowledge of the particular entity. So it could be, I don't know, let's pick something simple. It could be, a storefront or something, a major store that has multiple stores. I don't know, Pat's Pizzeria is coming to mind. Maybe it's lunchtime. So, like Pat's Pizzeria, I actually know the owner, but that looking at that and then talking to them, maybe when you walk in, there's some physical things that could be, better. And everybody has like a footprint. When you walk into, Walmart, it has a footprint. They've worked out their logistics things. So where are the areas that they could have weaknesses? And then learn, and I would say study that particular business entity, right? Do your homework. Because if you know the knowledge and you can speak with them, then all of a sudden you're in with them. And therefore they will disclose stuff to you that you probably didn't even want to know.
Exactly.
You will find where some of the compliance breaks are that sometimes don't present themselves in issues, or they don't present themselves because it's not a major catastrophe or something like that. And sometimes those are areas where, over time, it could be a major factor. So think about finance, right? And compliance,
Right.
0.01%, right? It sounds like a small amount. But if you're talking millions of dollars, that's a nice piece of chump change.
Sure.
And if it's happening iteratively, right? So I think those are some of the things I would do.
Thank you so much for that. I
You're
appreciate that.
I have a question.
Really?
Hi. So my question is, and kind of in the same vein, is for businesses that are kind of overwhelmed by audit and compliance and just feel like, oh my gosh, I have to do everything. How do you approach a smaller business to explain to them, or what are the levels of compliance? How do you explain the different levels and how they can enact plans that are robust for them, but also fit within their budget and fit within like the people that they have and what they can do? I find that is a driver that scares people and also makes them, defensive in these situations. So how do you approach people to explain all of those intricacies?
Absolutely. Again, kind of echoing what I mentioned for Elise, is that you want to make sure you understand that business. Or the entity or the problem that is trying to be solved. In regards to compliance, you got to remember compliance is more, it should be proactive, correct? But both compliance and audit are 90% of the time reactive, because you're looking at things that post-dated happened. You're evaluating data over a 6 months period of time. If I run reports every week or daily, then I'm looking at maybe 2 weeks and I'm looking at a sample of it. So take that knowledge And I would explain to the persons that I'm working with, whether it be an audit or compliance, to be honest, it's almost a similar skill set. Just one is more feared than the other. But basically, I would explain to them, and this is what we have to do. This is the reason why we're doing it. And then what I would try to find is something tangible specifically to that, whether it be an industry or niche, and then correlate it directly to that functional area that you need to review. With regards to how deep you go in regards to performing a compliance review, that depends on the complexity of the business, right? Like, for example, I wouldn't probably, go through the 50 steps, on something that is, a smaller entity, even within a larger company. I probably would look at, what are the key things in those steps in compliance that are essential? And then going back to my simplistic common thread, it's always going to be data. I can bluntly tell you 99% of it's always going to be data. And that's a good thing, because then that's a common thread, right? But then it's also something that you can also relate in listening to the people, let them talk more. And you will find out that they may have some insights and share stuff with you that you can actually attach and draw that correlation to. So those are some of I call them interviewing techniques, right? And just kind of keeping everything simple. They're not the experts you would be in that realm. So again, don't overwhelm them with having to know all the details. Just kind of help them and guide them through the process.
How do you make people more proactive instead of react? That's kind of what I kind of roundabout was asking too, is, if you can make a plan ahead of time and everyone is in sync with it and comfortable with it, then audit and compliance review ends up being a no-brainer. So like, how do you get people to do those things? Like what kind, anyway.
No, I kind of agree. I kind of agree with Lee in the sense of, could you help me understand, like, maybe a simple example that in practice, the person that has to be compliant could put in place as part of business as usual? Like, how? Yeah.
Absolutely. Let me think of a simple one.
I know it's not as simple.
I was going to say, sorry about the slap.
It isn't,
right.
because it depends. It's not there's never a cookie cutter, right?
Right.
The criteria are always the same. It's the execution of what you're utilizing for the criteria goes for the situation you're evaluating. So you could have 1,000 steps. Let's not talk about, PCI has over, 850 checkpoints, right? And that's payment card industry. So you're not going to go through all 850 checkpoints, or based on your evaluation and your interview, you may infer that some of those things are already addressed, right? Based on your observations as well. But in regards to your question, I would say that you want to sit with a person, you want to understand what it is that we're doing. You need to have that conversation up front. In order to have audit and compliance as part of your normal program going forward, you really have to get to the C-suite. Okay, you have to have buy-in, and in order to get that buy-in, you need to turn that into terms that they understand, right? So let me give you a specific example. I'm going to just use finance, because we all deal with finance probably on a daily basis, whether you have a checking account or not. So in finance, in the business sense, right, the senior executives, CFOs and what have you, are going to be dealing with worrying about the financial aspects and the healthiness of their company. But in regards to that, the business initiatives and their programs and their strategic drivers, maybe even initiatives that they want to implement, maybe they're merging and buying a small company, it doesn't matter. All of those components, it's great knowing what the program steps are, but if you can insert audit and compliance up front in the review process and in the dialogue, then that alleviates a lot of the back end, what I call reactive and residual cleanup that you have to do. And more importantly, that you could avoid the potential pitfalls, right? The problem with that is most organizations can't afford it. They can't afford it. Let's just be blunt and simple. And secondly, the other problem is, how do you present that in a way, knowing that they can't afford it, but it's important and it's essential to avoid, maybe if it's a financial organization, regulatory impact, right? is you have to be able to show it in terms that they understand. So see, I go back to the simple, keep it simple. So what did I do in that case, right? What I did personally and professionally is I actually sat down with them and understood what their drivers were. And then I laid that out to them. I said, oh, so this is the most important project. You're spending 70% of your, income on this particular project. That's me, it was, apologies. So you're spending 70% on your project. And as a result, you're not even focusing on the downstreaming effects that could transpire with that. And then when I show that to them, remember, it's the CFO we're still talking about. You show that to them in their cost structure. All of a sudden they're like, oh, I didn't realize it would cost me that much. Oh, I didn't realize it was that simple. Oh, I didn't realize I could save that much money. Sometimes showing the avoidance cost is a significant way to help people understand. I found that oftentimes breaking it back down into simple components. What is the core niche of that business entity? What are they really passionate about? What is that CEO or the organizational leaders really passionate about? What are the stakeholders really looking into? And now we're talking mid and large companies, right? Because smaller companies, small business companies don't have this bandwidth. So what is that they're interested in, right? If you can get to that and what they're passionate about, 90% of the time, you're going to knock down the walls and that barriers of their fear. And then they're going to actually begin to trust you, because that's another factor too. They need to trust that you are going to do what you say you're going to do, and what you're saying is going to really show them some benefit. The other example I would give you, and sorry for the long-winded response, but think of a technology department, because technology departments oftentimes are zero cost centers. They don't get, they're not that sexy group, right? The marketing department gets all the money and the benefits and the perks, and they get all the little cute little blazers and all that really nice stuff, right? But the technology department doesn't get all that. What do they get? They have to deal with the supply and demand. They have to deal with all the infrastructure. They have to deal with all those other various components. And then at the end of the day, back to my simple point, the data, they don't own it. 90% of the time they don't own the data. So, but they're responsible for maintaining and making sure it stays up and that system stays up and the server is running, right? So think of it in that terms, internalize it back to them. And I think that really goes a long way. Hey, Grace.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Grace.
I want to give Victor and David a chance to ask any questions, but I do have one question in the queue.
Oh, okay.
Me too.
Oh, I don't see it.
I don't know if they have any questions. I'm just kind of giving them a shout out. But my question is this: as we think about small businesses and the fact that the industry trend is to move towards, they now have to be compliant with things like PCI. Does PCI give them like a simple version guidance? Or is it the long list, 100-page PCI compliance document that we read it by need because that's our profession? But, we're talking about smaller businesses don't have the bandwidth, don't have, like, what is, from an industry trend perspective, how are we setting them up for success? I mean, and this is like, I don't know enough. It's so new.
Yeah. Small businesses have been what I call our lost leaders in this space, particularly because where they get their support and help from is maybe their internet provider. That's where they get a lot of their security constructs from, and if they have a tech person, right? So, and I have a couple small businesses myself. So even though I know everything I know, I wasn't putting money and energy and things in that regard. I put the money into my environment so that I can minimize anybody trying to hack into, my system, because I was dealing with private, personal data. So I would say that's pretty much the biggest thing. And I've seen the trends over that time over time. I've actually worked with a few small businesses, and that's been their biggest issue. I've also seen some smaller companies that provide or looking now to provide services, and I don't know if the pandemic drove this or what, because it actually started to increase, but they've been working with small businesses and trying to assist them, right? So they say, some of them, trying to assist them with, putting in the rigor that's necessary. Now, if you're dealing with products and services, or you have a POS, which is a point of sale machine, and that's a machine that you can either have the little cube or square, or you're swiping, or you're using your phone, with the digital, merchant selling and purchasing. In that case, that's another area of risk, right? So oftentimes the supplier that provided the app that runs on the device, not so much your personal device, but that enables that vendor to utilize that services, has the protection mechanisms in place. Now, is that a good thing? No, but it's better than nothing, right? I mean, if I'm in sales and this is my business and my livelihood, it's better than nothing. But a lot more companies are coming out of the woodworks that are actually providing a preemptive. Your environment was potential hack happen, we prevented it. A lot of external entities like BDO and Markham and other entities are actually looking in the small business space, where they're actually focusing on where they can provide that niche services. And it's a little lesser cost. Obviously, they're not charging the same fee they would charge, a big conglomerate like, say, JP Morgan or, Bank of America, but it is a smaller cost. And then also reciprocally, I've noticed, I did a little bit of research, and I saw that some of the banking institutions are actually, with their small business and their private clients, because those private clients have businesses, are actually trying to provide some type of services for them in that regard, and going into cloud technology and doing the secure mechanism that way. Now that's a big bite to chunk, to bite off, but it is going to provide, a better security for a lot of these smaller businesses. There is no one cookie cutter at this point in time, unfortunately. I would love to say that. I mean, we could all get together and we could create a business entity and do that. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, that I was just about to say, there's a huge market for this. I work at a company who started this like 3 years ago, and so yeah, there's a huge market to basically, or it's emerging, to come in and say, hey, this is this whole compliance craziness, and I know you're overwhelmed and you have to do something. I can break this down for you, given the size of your business and where your targets are, and then I can help you harden everything and understand everything, from policies all the way down to mechanisms. And then when you're actually, audited, you'll be ready, and I can tell you how you're ready. So yeah, I mean, I think that's it. Yeah. But the driver is, a lot of them have to be forced to do this. So like if they're small businesses that want to work with the government, they have to comply. Mm-hmm. And so, and it's the same thing, like government wise, you had to have a certain level of CMMI, comply, you had to be a certain CMMI level in order to get grants. And so, I think the same kind of business model as like CMMI services. You can do, audit and compliance services to help get through that process.
Well, yeah. One of the reasons why Temple was invited to share with Clone was exactly that. One of their products is specifically for small business. It's a multi-tenant in the cloud, and it helps the small businesses manage through regulatory and compliance issues at a very affordable price, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, from what I'm hearing, not that I know anything about what you folks are talking about, it's sort of like having a H&R block for compliance, creating an external third party, guys, frankly, if you develop such a company, I can provide the concierge service of finding you the legal and the executive help you need, and the financial to create the startup. Absolutely, we could create the startup, but that's not why we're here.
Can we use the CyberDia students? It's cheap labor.
Well, no, it's not the labor. The biggest issue would be creating, finding our VCs, venture capitalists and angel investors. And so absolutely, we can do that. So the question I have for you, Carmelia, just to tie it back to what Grace presented at the beginning, is that if someone were to listen to this at a lunch and learn and say, well, I already know much of this, I just don't have the credentials. How will taking your class help that process? In other words, yeah, there are many options. You can just be the local expert and everybody knows that, but you can't move from that job to another job because you're not credentialed, right?
So taking this course will provide them the framework and the foundation for them to pursue any type of certifications that they would need to have. I think also, to be honest, you can be a compliance person and not have a certification, right? You can be an auditor and not have an audit certification. You don't have to have that. But in order to, someone in that team would have to have had that credential, and they would be the person, the audit manager would have to have that for sure, and they would be overseeing it. So anyone taking this course will have a foundation of both work background and experiences, best case scenarios, and best practices that have been implemented and utilized within the United States and abroad. That's an exposure, I would call it a unique exposure that most people will not get in a lifetime. I'm not saying I'm great, but I'm just saying that in my young age, from the time that I've been doing this, and having dealt with over 1,800, touch points, there's not as many people in that field, in this field, that I know of. And so I deal with a lot of different entities, but I think that they're going to get a great foundation. It will set them up, and they will be prepped to be able to take any of those first level tests. I mean, they will be qualified, to be honest.
Excellent. I'm really excited about everything that we talked about today. I mean, it's such a subject that people just need to know more of, and we need to do more outreach. So I want to thank you, Carmelia, for sharing from your experiences, from your knowledge, for setting the framework, right? For setting the picture. And thanks everybody that attended. Elise, you want to do any closing questions, comments?
No, just I really appreciate everything that you said today. I learned a lot, and I actually had a very constructive lunch today, so I'm very happy.
Very good.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, folks, for attending this lunch and learn, and I hope you join us in a future one. Have a good one.